Okay, so hello and welcome to the first meeting of the Turba for autumn 2024. Turba, as you well know, addresses the history of alchemy broadly defined, and we will have three sessions in the coming 3 weeks. This was due to well, circumstances, but we will have Carmen today, Sergey next week, and Yusuf on the following week. But I will start by the meeting today. First, I would like to say that thank you to the Society for the History of Alchemy and Chemistry, which is providing its Zoom account for our use. The session, as I mentioned, will also be broadcast on the Shack YouTube channel, and it will be available probably on Monday. So today I am pleased to introduce Dr. Carmen Schmechel, who is a historian of chemistry and medicine. Her research focuses on medieval and early modern fermentation theories and practices and how they cut across chemical and medical thought. She's currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences, or KNAW, okay, V in Dutch, where she examines Dutch early modern fermentation within the ERC project Preservare. Her research was published in Ambix, Early Science and Medicine, and the British Journal for the History of Science, amongst others. More broadly, Carmen is interested in the philosophy of natural sciences, especially scientific models, and in how analogies are employed to create scientific knowledge. One such analogy is the one to be discussed today, and her talk is entitled The Analogy of Bread and Gold in Medieval Alchemy. One thing I would like to ask you while Carmen is sharing her PowerPoint file is to close down your mics because it makes a funny ring to for everyone else if you haven't already done so. Okay, Carmen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be part of the Turba tonight, and also welcome to everyone who's made it to the session, and also who's watching on YouTube afterwards. And so let me start by sharing my screen. Okay.
So
You
we
can all
can.
see my slides now?
Yes, I can see. I can
Perfect.
see the
Okay.
screen.
That's a relief. Okay. Okay. So should I start,
Yes,
Joe?
please. Yes.
Okay. So I have to start with a disclaimer because everyone here is likely in the business of the history of alchemy, so you will be aware of this, but this will also be a public lecture. So I have to say that we're talking about fermentation as it was understood in medieval times, which is obviously very different from how we understand it today, though there are some commonalities. So today we know about the role of bacteria and enzyme production and all that, but back in the 10th or even the 14th century, none of this was known, and people tried to draw conclusions about the nature of fermentation from just looking at how matter behaved in front of them, and also, on the other hand, from reading what other authors had to say about it. And so they realized that a similar process was going on in wine and also in beer and bread. So these were all qualified as fermentations even back then. And it sort of was logical because if you think that beer is made from grain, it's not that far out there to presume that it's the same process like in bread. And there are also some phenomenologically similar aspects like the production of heat or of bubbles. But then they didn't stop at the wine, beer, bread, and cheese part. They also presumed that fermentations were happening in other realms, like in embryology, and also in alchemy. when they thought about how metals allegedly transform into each other and into gold ultimately, they thought that that this is done by means of a fermentation, because fermentation was the process that was changing matter into something different. And so transmutation was actually the most, one could say, the most high-profile case where fermentation was thought to be at work. And let me here. This is the outline of my talk today. We're going to look at an early modern definition of fermentation, and then go back and look at the practical and the theoretical background, and then do a take a walk and do a sampling of a couple of medieval works that use this analogy. There's a lot more of them, but obviously I cannot talk about all of them. Okay, so now I'll tell you something how I got to this bread analogy. So this mysterious fermentation was posited in many alchemical works as one of the stages of transmutation. Now, I'm an early modernist, and reading the early modern works, I had encountered a lot of discussions about the fermentation of wine, and saw the fermentation of wine being employed to explain many other things like blood formation, digestion. These were mainly medical issues. But when I turned to the medieval alchemical works, I did not find the wine fermentation figuring as prominently. And now I have some suspicions why, but that's another story. It's certainly because they would have drunk less of it. Yeah, sorry, it isn't because they wouldn't drink less of it. So instead, the fermentation analogy that I kept running into from work to work was that of bread, and more specifically of bread dough. And now, how come exactly the fermentation of bread dough was found to be so apt to explain transmutation? I think for me, this turned out to have a practical dimension, but also a very strong theoretical underpinning in Galenic medical theory. And I will talk about both of these dimensions. And so let us begin with an early modern definition of ferment. So in Martin Rouland's Lexicon Alchemiae of 1612, fermentation is defined as you see, so the exaltation of a thing in its substance by means of the admixture of a ferment, which through its virtue, which was considered an occult virtue, distributed through the spirit, penetrates the whole mass and transmutes it into its own matter. Now, Rouland's definition is very typical of his time, and there's several medieval strands of thought that are actually flowing together into it. But so I want to focus on one aspect, which is this idea about the ferment penetrating the whole mass and then transmuting it into its own matter, that is, into the matter of the ferment. So this idea is essentially Galenic, not in the sense of humoral theory with which Galen is usually associated, but it regards pharmacological action, and it's the idea of whole substance action. And so it was also known as tota substantia. And the transmutation or the transformation of the lump into the matter of the ferment looks like a phenomenon of generation or as emergence, because it has properties which you don't find in the lump which gets transformed. So this is why I think that it's a case of emergence. So basically, the ferment acts like an inoculum. It's like a piece of matter that then transforms the whole lump. And from an early modern perspective, actually, this is sort of a quintessentially chemical process as opposed to a chemical one. And I found that this model underlies many descriptions of material change, which in early modern times were called fermentation. And it tends to be particularly popular with the alchemists and with the chemical philosophers, which is also to say it wasn't the only possible way of conceptualizing fermentation. There's also an alternative model of fermentation that was adopted by the mechanist philosophers, and it's quite different. And that one's based on the idea of mechanical rarefaction of matter driven by heat. And I wrote a paper about this a while ago, about fermentation as heat rarefaction. But as I said, this was with the mechanical philosophers. But with the chemical philosophers, it was the inoculum emergence kind of model. And this is the one that I'm focusing on today. Now, for some practical background. So I found that this chemical transmutation model that involves the ferment as inoculum most likely draws upon practical experience from bread making. So typically, the lump of dough from which you make the bread will become fermented rather quickly if you put into it a small quantity of ferment. So today, we put store-bought yeast. But in the past, it was common to use a piece from older dough that was already fermented. And this is known today as sourdough starter, and it's still practiced, but only by people who make bread at home. And in present terms, we know that such a piece of older dough would have a high concentration of microorganisms who then feed on the fresh flour from the new lump and so initiate fermentation. But practitioners from past centuries, of course, did not know this, but they also did not need to know it in order to perform the operation successfully, because this was practical, common knowledge, at least since late antiquity. I presume that it is much earlier than that, but that's where we have the sources from. So according, for example, to Pliny's Natural History, leaven was made out of the flour, which was kneaded before salt is added to it, and then boiled down into porridge and left until it begins to go sour. And if you want to speed up the process, you don't bother with the whole process, but just use the dough kept over from the day before. Now, parallel to this in ancient metallurgy, the technique of alloying, already supplied a framework for the idea that the multiplication of a mass of metal is in principle possible. Now, alloying works differently, but still, it was the idea that you can increase the mass in some way. And an analogy between the ferment of dough or bread and this presumed ferment of gold seems to have gained traction as well for describing transmutation. There's a new edition of the there's the Grégoire Lacazze's book where he also shows that the analogy of the ferment or the leaven that acts as multiplier in a metal mass may actually originate with Zosimos of Panopolis, who wrote much in a Galenic vein. Just as the leaven of bread, though in a small quantity, makes rise a great quantity of dough, so also acts a small quantity of gold or silver with the aid of this vinegar. Okay, so we also have this practical background being further transmitted throughout the Middle Ages. So fermenting flour and water to make bread was also practiced in medieval Islamic society. We find references to this in the works of physicians such as Avicenna, Ibn Sina, or Isaac Israeli. In Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, in a section titled of bread, there are descriptions of various types of fermented breads that attest to the popularity of fermented bread. So you can see here about fermented bread, which is well concocted, and then he mentions not to eat it fresh out of the oven and whatnot. But there's a lot about ferment and fermentation in bread. And so I found that it was different cultural frameworks that all carried over this analogy between leaven and the gold ferment. So we find also Petrus Bonus, and now I'm jumping to the 14th century, but there's a lot of these kinds of works in between as well. But the reason I'm jumping to Petrus Bonus is because in Preziosa Margarita novella, he seems at least to be described. Sorry, He seems to be describing a practical process. So it's not all, when you read a medieval work and the author says, the ferment so and so in 5 days it ferments the new lump and so on. You don't really, there's no way to know whether they really practiced this or whether they just took it from previous authors. But in Petrus Bonus, this description caught my eye because this seems closer to practice than other ones. So he says we mix the form of grain with a sprinkling of water. Afterward, we kept this dough in a glass vessel and it became a ferment by itself. And the ferment was made by its corruption and so on with a sour flavor in 5 days. Now, I have to admit, I did try this myself at home. It didn't take me 5 days. It took me more than 14. But obviously, the conditions are radically different, and we have different flour and different microorganisms and so on. So, yeah, but that was just for fun. Anyway, so then Petrus Bonus then goes on to explain how gold can be produced in an analogous manner from quicksilver with its own ferment. So quicksilver, which is fermented and converted to the nature of ferment, transforms into itself all liquefiable matter of its kind, and so on. And since its generation, according to matter in a proper sense, is made from quicksilver alone, just as gold is, therefore it will convert everything into gold. Now, this passage showcases how the analogy with bread making presented another strategic advantage. It could be used to support the hypothesis of mercury alone, an idea that is found in many medieval works. The theory of mercury alone entails that the only active component in the transmutation process is mercury, with other components, such as sulfur, being relegated to the status of impurities. While this theory came to maturity probably with Jabir, as William Newman has shown, some of the strands that went into the theory seem to be older. And such, for example, is this idea of quicksilver alone that is modeled on the ferment of bread. So mercury is said to originate from itself and to be all that is needed for transmutation, just as in the process of the fermentation of dough, the ferment starter ferments the dough which is then converted into further ferment. So I found that actually hardly any other natural phenomenon would have served as such a precise analogy for mercury alone than the fermentation of sourdough. And because otherwise it's very mysterious. You read it and it says, although it vivifies itself and it Mercury gives birth to itself and so on. It all sounds very esoteric, but as soon as you think of it as sourdough, it all falls into place, and you realize that they just looked at a process and they try to describe it in such terms. Okay. So now, while practice gives these procedural cues, my stance is that theory is also important and that transmitted theoretical ideas contribute significantly to the way natural philosophers thought about fermentation. And so, as far as theory is concerned, my hypothesis is that this chemical emergentist model of fermentation is based on the idea of whole substance action from Galen. And as I said, this was also known as tota substantia, and it referred, among other things, to the power of a drug or poison to affect the whole body. Although the quantity itself of the drug was very small, but you would ingest the poison and then suddenly your whole body would be transformed not that it be transformed into poison, but your whole body would be poisoned, would be affected by it in a way that would not be redeemable. And okay. And this kind of drug, Galen argued, worked in a manner that could not be explained by Aristotle's doctrine of manifest qualities and had to be explored by experience as opposed to theory. And so because it had to be explored by experience also because it was unpredictable. It you had other things at the end than you put into it, so it's again this pattern of emergence. And Galen sometimes calls this acting after specific form. And so he writes in my own doctrine, in the work that's called My Own Doctrines, he writes, it was shown too that some drugs act through heating, cooling, moistening, but there's a different class of drugs which act through their specific nature of their whole substance. And he gives examples. Some of those were purgatives and those known as destructive deleteria, which are basically poisons. So especially Galen's use of the idea of specificity or specific form reinforces this connection with emergence and with unpredictability of the resulting properties. And I think that perhaps, so Galen's dictum was very widely known about the whole substance action having to be discovered through experience, through pera, and not through method, not through methodos. And so this is it. It's possible that this dictum also inspired medieval alchemists to look towards everyday fermentations as a kind of observational or experiential starting point for inquiry into material transformations, and especially those transformations that seem to involve emergent properties. And so this is Galen's original idea, or part of it. And while Galen had not addressed fermentation explicitly in this context, later writers modeled their understanding of fermentative processes upon this Galenic mode of action of substances. And via Arabic medicine and alchemy, such as Avicenna's Canon of Medicine or Pseudo-Avicenna's De Anima, this angle of understanding fermentation was transported into the Latin West. And the framework was brought together with scholastic theories of mixture and of substantial form. But let us stop for a moment at Avicenna. And so in the Canon of Medicine, in Book 1, Avicenna explains how foods and drink, including those with drug value, act in the human body. So he says they act in three ways. What is eaten and drunk acts in three ways, either solely by its own quality or by its matter, or through its whole substance. And then he brings the whole substance in correlation with its specific form. And the main category of substances that act by this mode of action of whole substance, according to Avicenna, is that of poisons, venena. And later, the mode of action originally reserved for poisons was expanded to include also other material transformation, including ameliorative ones, provided they fit the pattern according to which the inoculum converts the larger target body into its own substance. So that's how come you'd have panacea, you'd have an elixir that could make your whole body healthy, regardless of what your initial ailment was, because the medicine would basically would convert your whole body into something that has a healthy quality. And medieval Latin alchemists co-opted these ideas readily into their transmutation theories as well as their medical alchemy, so that this inoculation emergence model became a mainstay of chemical thinking that persisted into early modernity. So now I will address a couple of concrete works. And I will go a bit quicker over them. So Pseudo-Avicenna's treatise De Anima, around which was actually, this is three works combined into one, around 1100. We have a beautiful edition from Sébastien Moreau, critical edition. So in this work, the author adheres to the analogy from bread making, both through the use of the term levamen, leaven, and through the comparison. So he says, so the author says the leaven is the ferment of gold and silver, and there is no other leaven. Or leaven is the thing which they put into the elixir in order to reduce the corpus maius into that matter out of which the ferment is made. And this the corpus maius is the equivalent of the lump, so the larger part of matter that is converted into the nature of the ferment. Now the next work I'm going to show on alums and salts, also from the Arabic realm. This is from the 12th century, and we also have a very a meticulous critical edition prepared by Gabriele Ferrario, which was published by Schack not long ago. So in this work, the analogy between fermenting gold and fermented bread is made explicit. So the author writes, gold is the ferment of the white and red elixirs that are not improved without it and are not completed with anything else. Like dough is not complete without its ferment. So there you go. Here it actually becomes explicit. So a bit later it says, then if you say, how come it is the ferment of the body? Consider then and look at the yeast of the dough. Is it something else or is it dough? And is this yeast a body or not? And so the idea is to see that actually both the ferment and the lump of dough belong to the same nature, or are essentially the same nature, but it's sort of in a different form or in a different stage. And the ferment accelerates the change of the lump. And here the processes of making and fermenting dough and the preparation of metal bodies appear as conceptually intertwined. Then there's also a chapter which is called On the Nature of Mercury, where we find a eulogy of Mercury, which alone, ipsum solum, is said to be many things. The ferment, which penetrates and raises, so leavens the bodies of metals, the agent of vivification and transmutation from one state into another, the water of life and the virgin milk, and so on. So here again, there's the connection between this analogy with bread and the mercury alone theory within the realm of transmutation. And so there's a dialogue between mercury and gold, and gold objected that itself, the gold would have a higher status, but the personified mercury gives this reply that you see here. So one part of me generates 1,000 parts of you. And so now it's become rhetorical. So it's not like in the older authors that you have 3 parts of mercury to one, so three parts of lump to 1 part of ferment, but now you have 1 part of ferment to 1,000, which is very much a rhetorical exaggeration. Now there's another work which is much less known than the others and which has no critical edition. It's a commentary by a certain Hortulanus on the Emerald Tablet, and there are several editions. I've looked at 2 of them, and the work displays the same pattern of modeling transmutation after the fermentation of dough. But notably, Hortulanus links this analogy very conspicuously with the Galenic tota substantia by way of the terminology. Sorry, this is the top here. So he says the whole substance, and he actually says tota substantia, of the stone becomes fermented by its nourisher, that is by the earth. He doesn't mean the planet Earth, obviously. He just means whatever is on the bottom of the vessel. So that the whole stone is converted into ferment. As in the making of bread, a small quantity of ferment nourishes and ferments a large abundance of bread and converts again the whole substance of the dough into ferment, having the same virtue in relation to another dough. And also, Hortulanos also subscribes to the mercury alone stance by linking it with the fermentation of the stone, which vivifies itself. So, in a different chapter of the same work, he writes, but that the stone is mineral is evident. No one doubts that it is the stone of mercury which mortifies itself, resurrects and vivifies and converts itself into gold. So to sum up, in Hortolano's work, mercury is said to be the physical transmutational equivalent of sourdough and sourdough ferment. And so we see how this mercury alone hypothesis is buttressed by this bread making analogy. I'll come to my conclusion. So fermentation was widely believed to be one of the main processes underlying transmutation. Based on Galen's theory of action through the whole substance, it also drew inspiration from the observation of everyday fermentation of bread. And this most likely ancient analogy not only survived throughout the Middle Ages, but in fact is found as late as the 17th century. And if we take a look at Ruland once again, we see that he too refers to dough and bread, and he writes about Sauerteig, also about ferment as well. Where is it? Okay. And okay, this is what you get when you leave flour and water to ferment. I told you I had to try this at home as well. So now today it is done differently. So you basically have to you put flour and water, but after one day you have to take half of it away and put new flour and new water onto it because the bacteria have to eat new flour. I have never seen this step being described in the medieval works, so I don't know whether it has to do with how flour is today or whether it has to do with something else. But anyway, after about 14 days of doing this procedure every day, I finally got the bubbles. And you can actually see the bubbles. They weren't there before. And so that was quite a moment. And so if you want to know more about the medieval stuff, here is the paper. You'll find it in Ambix. It's I think it's still the current special issue. And if you don't have a subscription to Ambix, I'm happy to send you this paper if you need it for personal use. And thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Carmen, for this very clear and very useful introduction to the analogy, this widespread analogy that has not been researched really before. I mean, it's always been there, I guess, but people haven't seen it. The question, of course, is why people haven't seen it before, and it's um, maybe it's so evident. Sometimes things are so evident that it just it didn't jump into the researcher's eyes. Or I don't know if you have a theory of why this has not been done before. I mean, like why did people not scholars, I mean, not draw attention to this before?
Um, I think they took it for granted. It's not that nobody saw it. I did find it in the literature. So um, it's in an alchemical lexicon. Lawrence Principe also draws attention to it somewhere else, and so um, it's mentioned in passing, and it's
Mm.
taken for granted, but nobody looked into it more closely, I guess. And for me, I think what really made it interesting was the fact that I could connect it with the galenic whole substance. So that's where I was at the same time also working on Galen, and that's at some point it clicked, and I think that's why it stopped also for me. It stopped being something self-understood, and I began to look into it more closely. How is it possible that this was? Why was this an apt analogy? Another thing is, as I said in the beginning, it it wasn't wine, it was bread, and so that also kind of like um, rattled me out of the comfort zone because I would have thought that it would be wine in some way, but then look, it wasn't wine, it's bread. It's you open the works, you read them, you see it's bread, and then you have to do something about it. So yeah.
I mean, it is also about I don't know. Here I'm talking about the experiential. I mean, the experience of having of looking at dough and looking at, let's say, mercury in a liquid form, doing, I mean, the it seems similar. I mean, it's you look at both, and there is something that is more. I mean, visually maybe connected than let's say wine.
Mm.
I mean, there is something like obviously this is how it should be. I don't know. It's um like a natural analogy. I don't know how to call it. It's very quick to make this kind of analogy.
Um, I think it also has to do with the fact that uh, gold or metals in general, it's supposed to be a lump. And so maybe bread was a more apt kind of fermentation because it's also the dough is also a lump.
Mm.
Uh, the wine actually makes much more sense in contexts where you have to do with tincture and with dyes. And so if your model was that you dye a new material, then the fermentation of wine would have been a better underlying analogy, or it would have worked better. But if you wanted to say that you transform the whole lump and not just dye it, then I think that's why the bread maybe was more apt.
Mhm. Yeah, this is very interesting. I would like to open up the floor to questions because I already see two hands up. So first up is Gary. Gary, can you
Sure.
yeah, please.
So the subject of leavening the whole lump is all over the Bible. So it was part of Middle Eastern culture to do this. And it was understood that a little leaven leavened the whole lump. That's actually a quotation from the Bible. So part of that culture, Middle Eastern culture, that was the case. So there's another source that hints that ordinary people thought that way. They didn't have to be philosophers or whatever else. It was just almost part of that culture.
Thank you so much, Gary. Yes, yes. So the biblical background is yet another layer in this, and I didn't get around to it just because it's also complex and it's also ambivalent in the Bible because you also have instances where it's actually a bad thing that the little leaven leavens the whole lump because you have, for example, one member in the congregation who's a sinner, then that contaminates the whole community. So that's another thing. But yes, you're absolutely right. This was there. This was part of the culture, and and the biblical strand is yet another one. So along with the medical galenic and along with the purely practical one, I think these all of these strands came together.
May I add one thought? I mean, actually, the total substantia as well is quite ambivalent, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, the whole idea of poison is, I mean, basically, you put something tiny and you destroy the person. Or this is kind of why poisoning were so seen as so awful, right? It was like you transform that person, you kill it, and it's like a big person, and like you have these stories of big people that you put something in their food and they're gone, and I think it's quite interesting that alchemy is somehow transforming the meaning of this. I mean, it's becoming a good thing, right? I mean, it's a positive thing, just as it is for bread, in a way. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, like this. Um, because also what I was also thinking, and this is kind of related, is yeah, I mean in the Bible you have, and this still ongoing, right? I mean you have like not fermented, uh, azima or whatever, the like flat that you have to take on religious days, but then you also want this nourishing thing, which is which is fermented bread.
Yes. So this is a fundamental ambivalence that's there, and you can actually see it even in the Greek word pharmakon, which can be a medicine, but can also be a poison. And so it's I can't even say which one of these is the primary one. I think my intuition is actually that this basically describes a mode of action. It describes a way of the way in which a substance propagates itself in a larger lump. And now whether that's a good thing or a bad thing depends on what the nature of the substance is. So if the nature of the ferment of the small part is corrupted, then it's going to corrupt the whole lump. And then it's going to lead to putrefaction, if we're talking in terms of putrefaction fermentation. So it's going to lead to putrefaction, which is the flip side of fermentation. But if it's a good thing, then it has the power to transform the bigger lump into something better. And so that became actually a metaphor, on the one hand, on a metaphor for spiritual amelioration or exaltation. That's why Ruland calls it exaltatio, because it's the exaltation of matter. It's like a spiritual improvement. But it can also be the flip side. It actually the exact opposite of that. It can be the total corruption.
Mhm. Thank you for that. Elena Morgana has a question. Elena, can you ask it?
Yes. Hi, thank you, Carmen. I was curious as to when you were mentioned the that fermentation was understood as a more of a common process also used for wine, for example, in production of beer and wine. And so, of course, my mind went to spirit of wine and or different solvents. And in my research, I've seen that they have an equally laborious process, basically, in being made. And so I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more to the correlation or difference between these two processes as two different or similar ways of penetrating matter and transforming it from within. And of course, one might be sometimes a stage that comes prior to making the solvent, but I was wondering if you'd seen in medieval sources these two substances being connected at all, like
Um,
leaven, spirit of wine, for example.
hmm, so I'm reserving the right to be wrong. So I don't know, but my first intuition is where I've found leaven, I did not find the spirit of wine. Um, I think that they, um, So where the spirit of wine is central, it has to do more with distillation processes, which were of course a bit later than the leaven bread and
Yeah.
so on. There is a time when you might actually have encountered both of them, but I think usually it's either or.
Mm-mm.
Except of course in the books where you have you know de alimentorum facultatibus or something, you know, where you have basically all the foods. And then of course they talk about both of these things, but not necessarily in an alchemical way. Yeah.
No, yeah, it's fine. I just found a lot of similarities in the processes, but I know that yeah, perhaps they coexisted at a certain point, but of course it's different traditions and they can, both of them, as you've said, can be interpreted both spiritually but also in a very practical way. So it's difficult to say, I suppose.
The spirit, so distillation is another great metaphor for spiritual amelioration or exaltation. So both fermentation and distillation were used in this sense. It's what else did I want to say? I thought about something else while you were saying it, but I forgot. Anyway.
Well,
Thank you.
maybe I was just thinking that obviously the kind of when you look at this kind of lists of processes that lead to the philosopher's stone, for instance, you see usually see fermentation as one of them, and also some kind of distillation or sublimation or I mean, there is a sense of, all these things are processes that can be used towards, making the perfect elixir or perfect something. And I think that's where the resemblance is about subtilizing, right? Subtilizing matter. Not yeah, I mean it's about taking something that is physical and making it less so, whether you call it spiritual or not. It's about like making it very fine and then kind of reinserting it back into something physical that is better somehow. So yeah, I guess this is where the I guess the religious also the religious metaphor works with this kind of thing.
Yeah, this is particularly true for distillation, uh, but uh, but yes, also fermentation per se was also seen as ameliorating matter in this manner. And oh, so I remember what I had thought about while Elena was talking. Well, it's also that wine sometimes goes bad in the barrels. And so the possibility exists that the whole barrel then reverses and becomes contaminated. And so I think this was also one of the backgrounds of how people thought about the flip side of fermentation and the fact that it has this ambivalency.
Mhm. I see that Guthrie has a comment in the chat about yeah, and it's his I think he's right. I mean there is an image in Aurora Consurgens about a man kneading dough in a trough, which is surely related, he suggests.
Oh, this is in the chat. Sorry.
Yes, it's
Getting dough in a trough. Very
yeah.
possible.
Yeah, I remember there is one. It's like a real weird creature that has like this kind of troll, and he's needing something there. So it's
Yeah.
the
Oh, Gary.
imagery is as well.
So Gary wrote something. How do you stop the process? Vinegar is a natural result of fermentation. Well, this is huge. So here's the thing. So people thought for a long time that, for example, the wine is something like causa finalis, or like the teleology of grapes. The problem was that nature just keeps transforming the matter, and then wine turns at some point into vinegar, and though you have a hard time saying that vinegar is the teleology of wine because it's not necessarily a good thing, it's a worse thing. So you don't want to look at this as being the goal. And so yeah, that's an issue, and that's and for example, in Petrus Bonus' Preciosa Margarita novella, you have the role of the alchemist becoming quite prominent because the alchemist, as in the human person who's directing the process, has the task to stop the process at that exact moment where it's supposed to have achieved the magisterium. Because if, for example, you have a work going on, so like a chemical process, if you don't stop it at the right moment, it just goes on and transforms into something that you don't want to have. And so, yeah, stopping it at the right moment is very important.
Yeah, it's interesting because this transformation, yeah, I mean it's also about how you judge it. I mean, when is it good and when is it bad? I mean, it's like what kind of standard do you use against I mean, do you just rejoice in the transformation itself, or do you think, oh wait, I mean, I need to eat this bread, so I'd better not let it, you know, go go bad and all that, and transform into something else.
Yeah, depends on what you want to achieve.
Yeah, I was actually thinking, you know, what you said about the this experiential dimension. I mean, the fact that you had to wait 14 days to turn that to produce that ferment in the
Well, I
dough
thought it would
while
never happen.
that's yeah, maybe it was just poetics from Petrus Bonus, but I wonder, I mean, if there is a level where we it's just the hygiene of modern life where things don't happen anymore. Like, you know, it's like maybe they you know, there was like so much more bacteria and viruses and whatever back then that it was more customary to witness transformation. Yeah, like Gary says, we're too clean for our own good. So
Yeah,
it's
um,
an
it's
interest.
very possible. Yeah.
So maybe we just don't have enough bacteria, and I mean, yeah, there is this. I mean, this of course ramifies into our whole way of living today, and whether it's become less. I mean, this kind of transformations are not so striking because they happen less often or less powerfully than it used to be in the past.
Um, of course, there are several factors. So you have, obviously, the microbiological profile of your flour, water, and so on. You also have the temperature. Um, so at higher temperatures, not very high, but like at moderately high temperatures, it goes pretty quick. And indeed, once you got it started, it actually really, at some point, it really almost doubles overnight, which was a big shock for me. But until I got it there. So yeah, definitely it works differently today. Also, it was my first try. So Alex Angerhofer writes that for him it works within a week. Well, I guess you have more experience. So yeah.
He says I live in Florida. Well, that kind of explains it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in well, yeah, I mean that's another question. I mean, it's the geography of these things, you know. It's I mean, it obviously would happen more often in the Middle East maybe than in the northern countries or something like that. I don't know. It's something to think about.
Oh, they were very aware of these kinds of differences back in medieval times. you'd have all the treatises saying, well, about wines, for example, you have these wines with these, what we call today the terroirs. But in these regions, you have such wines and they give such and such headaches. In other regions, you have they grow differently, and it was like this for a lot of plants and a lot of agriculture, that there were massive differences depending on areas, which
Mhm.
is obvious. But
Yes, but yeah, I think they're more open as well. I mean, I think, and of course, the Orient is always kind of like a kind of standard in a way. I mean, the Middle Eastern area is like because of the late antique, I guess, inheritance of these cultures. Um, but yeah, I'm still fascinated by this the problem of why religiously, for instance, some they prefer not leavened as opposed to leavened. I mean, I mean, is it a religious thing or is it because they just had the experience that if they ferment too much, then things will die and they are not that pure or something, or there is some issue of purity there that they
uh,
were.
I think this is a long story, and it's
Uh, uh,
quite complex.
Joe, I can answer that question for you simply.
Okay.
Uh,
Right.
for
Thanks.
the Jewish people that went back to Egypt, they didn't have time to ferment the bread. They needed to get out of town in a hurry.
Yeah.
Okay, so they took the dough, but it didn't have time to ferment. They had to get out of town. So it's a memory of Egypt that leads to the religious importance of unleavened bread. It reminds them that they were delivered from Egypt overnight, for what it's worth.
So I think
Mhm.
this has to do with Passover, and so it's
Yeah,
for
yeah, that's the whole point.
yeah.
That's how the unleavened side of it got there. It was a time issue.
But it doesn't mean that the Jewish people didn't ferment any bread in
Oh, of
other
course they
in
did.
other
They ordinarily
circumstances.
did. That's the
Yeah,
point. They ordinarily fermented their bread, but they didn't have time.
yeah.
They had just beat it out of town, and but they remember the Exodus with unleavened bread. That's how it arose.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, of course, you have this kind of preference for unleavened also in other religions. I mean, you also have it in Islam as well. I mean, it's I guess it's inherited, and there is an issue of um I mean there is a wider issue as well about the importance of this of purity of not changing something or something like that.
I think that there's this sort of it's this instability. It's this instability in the ambivalence that it can ferment and be good, but then it can also putrefy and suddenly turn into the other thing. And I think that this kind of slippery situation might have worked in favor of the idea of having an unleavened bread in other situations than the Passover.
Mhm.
Possible, so that they were afraid that it would contaminate or that it would somehow remind peop people in some way of contamination.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, when you think also about the plague, that they often thought that it was some kind of thing in the air that would ferment or they would somehow yeah, basically transform the get inside people and transform them or something or corrupt them or something like that. That's um
Yeah,
another path to think about.
epidemics and contagion are within the same cluster of concepts.
Okay, I'm aware of time, so uh I I'm, I mean this was very enjoyable for me. I hope it was also for you to discuss this this matter, and also I mean all the implications of fermentation, and thinking about all the ramifications it has, I think, in different sides of culture. So will you join me in thanking Carmen for this very interesting presentation? Thank you so
everyone.
much.
Thank you, Joe. I enjoyed it very much, and
And for
I
another
lost
time
track of
as
time as
well.
well. Yeah.
And I would, of course, I would like to invite you next week. So the same time, and it will be the same link, to hear Sergei Zotov, discussing basically the imagery in medieval alchemy, and more specifically the role of the visual example in the transmission of the late medieval alchemical iconography. So thank you again, and thank you everyone for coming. And I'll hopefully I'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone. Bye bye.
Bye.